Let me ask one question, and then we'll recognize as many people as possible. This hearing is about consequences of a bad peace deal. I think a bad peace deal would include a deal that somehow attempted to suggest that Russian-speaking portions of Ukraine, naturally because of that, would prefer to be dominated by Russia rather than governed by their own national government. How do we accurately assess for world public opinion the feeling of these people in many of these areas of Ukraine? They're occupied now by the Russian government and by the Russian army. My position is that doesn't mean they want to be. They were close to the Russian border, and they've been conquered temporarily, occupied at least temporarily by a large invading army. Ms. Lubakova, you mentioned that people in Belarus, that a large majority of people in Belarus do not wish to be dominated by Russia. So I'll start with you, but I'll take an answer from each of you. How do we measure in a convincing way the attitude of people that are currently being dominated by Russia in such a way as to convince leaders in our own country and public opinion makers around the world as to how these people actually desire to be governed? And I'll start with you, Ms. Lubakova. Yes, I think we need to press the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a very important question. So when it comes to Belarus, I think we've seen 5 years ago, in 2020, mass protests in Belarus, historic, the largest that we've ever had. Hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets, but they faced brutal repression, state terror, and we have a large number of political prisoners still today, and actually repression continues still today. People are being arrested on a daily basis. That means that the regime also feels that they have not given up, even though they cannot, of course, come out to the streets and show their resistance. That's clear because of fear and because of persecution. That's one thing. So let's remember that people resisted, despite the fact that Belarus is not a young dictatorship. That's been a dictatorship for 3 decades, and people have always been arrested in our country, and they still came out to the streets and protested. The second hard data that I have for you to prove that people of Belarus are resisting, they are against Lukashenko and they're against being part of this war of the invasion, is actually sociology, and that's still possible. The Chatham House, British think tank, published actually waves of surveys of Belarusians inside the country, and they consistently show that people are against Ukraine being attacked from the territory of Belarus, are against being part of the invasion, are against the deployment of nukes, right? So that's the data that we have, and I'm happy to share this and attach to my testimony. And then, of course, that's also the information coming from us journalists. We independent media reaching many people inside the country on a daily basis, on a weekly basis. There's millions of people. People are still willing to get information. We have the numbers. We see that people still want that. And I think that's one of the best proof, also best evidence that people have not given up. And I think another, perhaps the last data and the last figure and information that I would share, the absolute majority of people, more than 95%, want Belarus to be independent. They don't want Belarus to be part of Russia. Again, that has been consistent for decades, and I think that's another important piece of information.
Mr. Kapoli, would you like
Thank you. Methodologically speaking, it's quite difficult to measure in a convincing fashion the sentiments of a people when they are under an oppressive regime. Generally, during times of war or occupation, because the system is so oppressive, it's really, really difficult to gauge the opinion of a people or their sentiments. But there are a few ways of looking at the developments in those situations. For example, when we look at Armenia, prior to the Velvet Revolution, it was dominated under a sort of a Russian puppet regime, and you had mass uprisings that overthrew that regime and had a democratic transition. So when you have organic movements led by people against an authoritarian regime, these are very clear indicators that whereas previously we were not able to gauge convincingly proper sentiments, but subsequently the facts speak for themselves. In the regions of Ukraine that are now under the occupation of Russia, it is very, very difficult to convincingly demonstrate, that is, empirically demonstrate, in a percentile sense, what the sentiment of the people will be. But we could look at Euromaidan and see how popular it was throughout Ukraine, even in the Russian-speaking areas. So in that context, we do have precedent that we could rely on, which can allow us to understand and observe the extent to which no people want to be under the yoke of oppression. In the case of the Ukrainian Russian-speaking population that finds itself under Russian occupation, if we observe what their behavior was, what their sentiments were during Euromaidan, which is highly supportive of getting rid of Russia's influence, that I think stands and even could be increased exponentially in understanding where these individuals, these people stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. I'll make a few brief observations. First, when it comes to Ukraine, I think it's important to recall that there are millions of Russian-speaking Ukrainians who have been ejected or have fled from Russian-occupied regions and would very much like to return. I think that's an important piece of information to consider when looking at kind of the wider process. It's also true that we should look at Russia's actions in those regions, and that Russia is actively colonizing those regions by settling Russians from Russia in those regions, by, in some cases, literally building new apartment blocks over the rubble of Ukrainian cities. And it is requiring that those that do remain take Russian passports, to adopt Russian curricula. So there is a settler colonial element to this as well that I think is very important. We cannot look at the composition of the present state of occupied Ukrainian territory in a snapshot, but rather look at it in the context of the situation. That's true of Moldova as well. In Transnistria, for example, it is a complex demographic environment where there are not only ethnic Russians, but also substantial ethnic Moldovan and ethnic Ukrainian minorities that have been under a period of repression for decades and have been normalized to a system of government, a repressive system of government, as well as an economic system that normalize a certain type of system. So being able to appreciate those things, I think, requires us to look at what Russia has done, is doing, and the ways by which it is artificially skewing the demographic composition of these places.
Thank you. And just one follow-up, Mr. Cesari. For a Western government official to cite the bogus elections that were forced upon the people in eastern Ukraine is a grave mistake, is it not?
Chairman Wicker, I cannot agree more with that statement. And I think that goes back to the point I was trying to articulate, in that such elections, for one, are artificially, to the extent that they're even properly counting anything, they're doing so on a skewed demographic that has been heavily engineered by repression, and repression that has been engineered by Russia.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.